And like, we've done in the other sessions, we'll have, you'll have, we'd like for you to ask questions. I mean, the idea is for this to be relatively relaxed, but, to have a conversation afterwards. We also want to give priority to junior people. So if you want to ask a question and you are, or you consider yourself junior, sorry, and then get their questions. Those would go. See some new or old faces like I haven't seen before, and I've heard Heather. I didn't see her, but in fact, Heather will be one of our speakers. So with that, if I haven't left anything out, Nicole, you do this out.
Yeah, you're a bit frozen, Ira, but I think the gist was understandable. So we're very happy today to have a very special speaker, Petra Schumacher, the co-founder of the German Experimental Pragmatics Network. So one thing before I introduce Petra, I put in the chat a link to our new YouTube channel. So we will post all the recordings on that channel so you can sign up for it. And maybe a bit of qualification. So by junior researcher, we mean a PhD or early postdoc. So looking young doesn't really count. And so Petra has a very impressive CV. So she did her PhD at Yale University, and soon after she got an Eminöter grant to work at the University of Cologne, where she also got a professorship soon or during that time actually. She, as I said, together with Uli Sauerland, she initiated this big collaborative research program, XPrag.de in Germany. And recently she was also awarded another huge Momentum grant. And Petra is most well known for her work on referential processing and metonymy, and especially with the EEG method. So today we'll hear her talk about real-time processing of metonymy. And we should say cheers to Petra.
Yeah. Let me just add, because I didn't mention, when you do have questions, to send them to either me or Nicole.
I thought to general, like to everyone in the chat.
Well, that gets kind of complicated, but feel free. We'll figure it out.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of this XPrag wine series. I think it's a great opportunity to at least see everyone, or the few few faces that I see on my screen right now. So today I will provide an overview over the research on metonymy and discuss aspects relating to the representation, processing, and evolution of different types of metonymy. So let's have a look at the intentions of the speaker. So the speaker here, who utters the Cabernet Sauvignon, talks a lot, intends to refer to the orderer of the particular wine or the consumer of the particular wine. So that means he uses an expression that does not explicitly name the intended referent, but has some meaning relation to it. So here the speaker employs a creative way of referring at the expense that the hearer needs to draw certain inferences. The speaker opts for brevity at the expense of clarity, to a certain extent at least. And he opts for brevity because maybe the name of that person is not known, or because the description of who he wants to refer to is too long, right? So it's kind of a referential shorthand. In addition to this trade-off between the principles of brevity and clarity, certain uses of metonymy may also evoke additional inferences about the speaker's attitude. So for instance, in this quote from The Great Gatsby, what we see later on is there's a place for person metonymy East Egg condescending to West Egg and carefully on guard against its spectroscopic gaiety. And so here the speaker alludes to differences, one in the social status, that is, people born of wealthy families live in East Egg and newly rich people in West Egg. And on the other hand, he alludes to differences in attitude, that is the snobby, corrupt East Egg people versus the modest West Egg people, right? So this is not what I want to talk about today, but I wanted to point out that we could also convey a speaker attitude here. So the language system makes available numerous other instances of metonymy. So we have the property for person one with the Cabernet. We have the place for person with East Egg and West Egg. In 3, we have the student read Dickens, where we use the name of the author to refer to his work. In 4, my neighbors met during Woodstock, we use the place name to refer to an event that occurred there. In 5, Henrietta took a picture of the stone lion. We use an expression that denotes an animal, but we actually combine it with a material adjective. And in the end, we end up with just something of the shape of a lion and no other features actually of the original denotation. In 6, Arthur drank the goblet, not just for Merlin. We have another case where a container is used for the content. So he didn't drink the goblet, but whatever was in the goblet. And in 7, I am the black bean veggie burger. We have an example of a predicate transfer where in this case, the meaning adjustment is made explicit by the copula. So this all could potentially fall under the heading of metonymy, but there are nuanced differences between these kind of metonymies. So you might have possibly flinched when you first read the title of the talk and you heard the Cabernet Sauvignon out of context, but you probably even didn't think about the meaning of reading Dickens, right? And so, in fact, there are principled reasons to distinguish different types of metonymy. And today I would like to convince you that there are reasons on the basis of the representation and the processing. And maybe this all is due to historical developments in meaning change. So in the following, I want to demonstrate that metonymy is not a uniform phenomenon. So this is reflected in differences in representation and the inferential demands. It's mirrored in differences in processing. And ultimately, I want to make a bold proposal that these differences might emerge because of language evolution and actually reflect different stages in semantic change. So let's first look at the representation of metonymy. Right? So I would like to look at these 2 examples here. So the Cabernet Sauvignon as an example of a ad hoc use of a particular expression that relies on situation-specific parameters to actually arrive at the intended meaning. And on the other hand, these cases of reading Dickens, where we have a more conventionalized use that relies on semantic and conceptual associations. So for the ad hoc metonymy, which are generated on the spot, they depend on the situation of utterance. So for instance, in a restaurant context, it probably makes sense to refer to somebody by the drink that they have ordered, if it's a salient property. But what we actually have to do is that to arrive at the reading, the Cabernet Sauvignon refers to a person contextually associated with the wine. We need to ultimately perform a reference shift from the property to the individual. And Nunberg, who has worked extensively on this particular type of metonymy, has argued that has suggested that there are 3 prerequisites. First of all, this type of metonymy works whenever there is a salient or noteworthy property that we can use. So in the talk today, it would probably not make sense to refer to somebody as the Cabernet Sauvignon, because if you all stick to the menu, there should be a bunch of people here drinking a Cabernet Sauvignon, right? you might actually refer to me as the Cabernet Sauvignon because I might be more salient with respect to this particular property.
Petra,
Right?
Petra,
Yeah.
there are these red lines on the screen. I think it's, do you see them on your slides? I don't know if other people see this, but.
I don't have it on my slide, no.
Okay. Nicole and I see
I
it.
can see it. I can see.
I can see it on mine, yeah.
Yes, me too.
It's
Okay.
strange.
You want me to
It looks like,
and share the screen again?
Maybe it's something with the mouse you're doing.
yeah, and it moved because it used to be more on the right and then it moved to the middle. So I'm assuming it's,
But it doesn't really matter. If it doesn't
yeah,
do
if it,
anything, it
don't,
doesn't really
we
matter.
don't want to waste our time about it, but I just thought if you could, if it's something that you saw on your screen to somehow get rid of it. But
Well, it's not on my screen.
there we go. It's off.
Is it gone?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I don't know. I didn't see it. Okay, so where was I? There should also be a functional correspondence between the property and the referent. That is where, oh, is it coming back again?
Yeah, it's back.
Yeah,
So apparently someone is
I'm not
able
touching anything. Okay, this is very weird.
So Josh Martin says you need to turn off annotate in the screen share settings.
Okay. Well, I'm not touching anything, so I'll put my hands up here. So there should be a functional correspondence between the property and the reference, so that we are talking about the orderer of the wine, or somebody who's wearing a particular piece of clothing, or an expert on a particular topic, and so on. And finally, there should be contextual support. So in this case, possibly the restaurant setting, but we could also imagine a different context. For instance, the Cabernet Sauvignon could refer to the owner of a vineyard who produced an award-winning Cabernet, right? So overall, this is a kind of metonymy that needs a little bit more information and grounding in context and in terms of functional correspondence and so on. So typically, in the literature, we find that this has repercussions in grammar, in that the original meaning, so the property, is no longer accessible after reference shift. And there's some diagnostics that have been proposed. They work, some work better, others don't work so well. But in general, if co-predication and coordination are used, they could actually indicate that the original meaning is no longer accessible. And this is what we see in one here. So the Cabernet talks a lot and has a rich flavor of black and red fruit. Sounds odd, because once we figure out that the Cabernet refers to a person contextually associated with the Cabernet, it cannot predicate or it cannot be combined with has a rich flavor. On the other hand, the Cabernet talks a lot and has a captivating smile is fine. So this wants to illustrate that the reference transfer has taken place. And so whatever we predicate over the referent again refers to the person and not the property. And the same with pronominal co-reference here, where we can refer to the person but not to the property. On the other hand, when we look at the conventionalized metonymy, what we see is that reading Dickens is a case where we have a strong semantic conceptual relation, so we can use the encyclopedic knowledge of Dickens to arrive at the intended meaning that it's a book by Dickens or his work or his novel. And so this seems to suggest that there's some kind of sense selection or derivation. So what we need for this is either a rich lexical representation, for instance, like the one proposed by Pustejovsky, where we specify the makeup of a concept, its constituents, its purpose, its origin, and so on, and therefore can establish this link between the author and his work. Or there's an underspecified representation that, depending on context, is going to help us pick the appropriate sense within this particular context. And these tests also work to show that here different senses are equally accessible. So for co-predication or coordination, we could say the student read and met Dickens in 1845. So it's fine to use Dickens to refer to both the person and the work. And pronominal co-reference also works when we have the student read Dickens referring to the work. We can continue this by saying he fascinated her, meaning he, the author. So both senses seem to be much more available than in the case of the ad hoc metonymy. So, so that means what I would like to call conventionalized uses then is reflected by having the different senses equally accessible in the mental representation. And so the process that we need to arrive at the intended interpretation is a process of sense selection. And on the other hand, the ad hoc uses rely on a process of referential shift. So that is, we have some reconceptualization. We need to update the discourse representation. And ultimately, the original denotation is no longer accessible in the mental representation, but only the intended referent. So this then should be reflected in language processing. And there has been quite a bit of work on metonymy since the late 1990s. And so what we find for these conventionalized uses with sense selection is that processing the metonymy, the student read Dickens, is as straightforward as processing the student met Dickens. And there's evidence from eye tracking and from event-related brain potentials. And this has been shown for all those cases where the senses are familiar. So if the sense is not known or not established yet, there are processing costs. So in this sense, Frison and Pickering carried out a series of studies where they introduced a name like Needham. The student read Needham, and if we don't have a representation of Needham being an author, then we stumble across this author for work metonymy, and processing cost is exerted. But if we have a particular context in which, for instance, we say my grandmother had all the books of Needham in her library, she read Needham on her way to the beach, then it's fine again. So it suffices to have some cue in the context that tells us that we're talking about an author here to carry out the sense selection. But if it's just a name, that's not sufficient. Yeah, so we need some kind of lexical or encyclopedic knowledge for this. Well, it's also the case that minimal context suffices to arrive at a meaningful interpretation. So if you take the examples on the right, the student read Brecht versus the student met Brecht, we see that when we record event-related brain potentials, that there's no difference between the two uses of Brecht. But on the other hand, if we have these questions on the left-hand side, where it would be possible to say something like, whom did the student read, kind of reflecting this metonymic shift, then we observe processing costs at the predicate to read, because read requires a complement that is an object, but whom signifies an animate entity. So there's a semantic, morphosemantic feature mismatch here that results in a more pronounced negativity around 400 milliseconds compared to something like what did the student read or whom did the student meet. So why I think that these data are interesting is that on the one hand, we see that during compositional processing, feature mismatches can result in processing costs when the argument does not provide any lexical information to kind of repair the mismatch or suppress the mismatch. But in a minimal context like the student read Brecht, we seem to have sufficient information to quickly arrive at the intended interpretation at no further cost. But there's one other aspect that I would like to mention about these conventional metonymies, and that is that we need to think about what it means that there is no processing costs. So how does sense selection work after all? And in a study that I carried out with Valentina Bambini and Louis Bott, who are here tonight as well, we used the reaction time paradigm, the multi-response speed accuracy trade-off paradigm that allowed us to disentangle speed and accuracy. So what happens in this task is that the stimuli were presented to the participant word by word. And here we looked at metonymy and metaphor processing. And once the last word was presented, which was the metonymy or the metaphor, 15 auditory cues were presented in a serial order, and the participants earlier were trained to respond to these cues automatically and as quick as possible. So in this experiment, the question was, does the sentence make sense? And so the participants then, once they heard the first beep, they started pressing a button, and they started with one button. And when they, with the button, this makes sense. And when they realized that the sentence doesn't make sense, they switch to the other button. So that way, you can first of all see when people arrive at a meaningful interpretation and how accurate they are at arriving at this interpretation and the time course of this. So what SAT gives us is a time course function that reflects the accuracy of the interpretation measured in D prime across time. And so what I try to show here in these schematic illustrations is that on the left-hand side, we have a case where we have two conditions, the blue condition and the gray condition. And what you can see is that the asymptotic level of performance is higher for the gray condition than the blue condition. That is, the probability to arrive at a meaningful interpretation is higher for the gray condition than for the blue condition. So this is an asymptotic difference that just reflects the level of performance, the probability of reaching the intended interpretation. On the right-hand side, we can see that the time course, so the rate or the intercept, might differ between the conditions. So what I have tried to illustrate here is that the blue line, first of all, shows a slower rate at which accuracy grows from chance to the asymptote, right? So it takes longer for the blue rate to reach this accuracy level. And at the same time, we also see here that there's a later intercept of the blue line relative to the gray line. That is, the point at which D prime departs from chance is later for the blue line than for the gray line. Yeah? So by using SAT, we can actually look at the accuracy, but we can also look at different speed parameters. And so we compared Italian stimuli. The student reads Camilleri, whereas the reporter interviews Camilleri. And what we found is a lower asymptote for the metonymy relative to the control condition. And what you see here is a selection of 8 individual participants. So the dashed lines actually reflect the mean SAT function averaged over all participants. And then the solid lines are the individual responses of the participants. And what you hopefully can see in all these figures is that for all of them, the student reads Camilleri had a lower asymptote, that is a lower probability of arriving at the intended interpretation than the control condition. And here is just another plot. So what we can see is that the asymptote shows a reliable difference with a lower accuracy for the metonymy in blue relative to the control condition. There was also a small difference in the dynamics, in that the intercept differed in the subject analysis, but because it only differed in the subject analysis, I think it might also be attributable to individual differences that might have to do with the familiarity of the authors or producers that we used here. Yeah. So overall, no costs in terms of the time course of processing for conventionalized metonymy, but still effort and differences at arriving or selecting the appropriate sense, right? The picture is different for the ad hoc metonymies. So there we find processing cost for the Cabernet talks a lot relative to the Cabernet is out of stock or something similar. And this is reflected in a late positivity in the ERP signature, which has been linked to updating of mental representations, and here in particular of the referential shift and the reconceptualization from the property to the person. We also find this in eye tracking measures. So this is work that I conducted with Stephen Frison and Andrea Crott and colleagues. And what we find here also maybe very quickly is that there's a later effect of the metonymic change on total times, yeah, where the metonymy in blue at the target or the spillover region shows longer reading times. We also find more regressions on the spillover region for the metonymy relative to the control condition, but no effects in the early measures of first pass and selective regression pass. So overall, what we see is that the more readily accessible conventionalized metonymy contrast with the ad hoc metonymies. Yeah? And there is accumulating evidence from other meaning alternations for this distinction. And I think I'm just listing it here because I'm slightly running out of time. But as you can see, so it's not just the reading Dickens and the Cabernet Sauvignon, but there are other cases of meaning alternation that fall within the sense selection category or the referential shift category. So, well, I think we can see that these different types of meaning adjustment should be distinguished, but where does this difference come from? And so here I would like to propose that the two types of metonymy are tied to communicative needs and the use of a particular expression as a function of time. There is a communicative need of a speaker, and that results in the selection of a particular linguistic form. And this language use may be repeated across time and across speakers. So if we add the dimension of time or dispersion, this would allow us to describe discrete stages of the evolution of meaning. So, right. So on the one hand, there would be these individual acts of innovation that might be just an on-the-spot creation of a meaning. There might be uses in a particular context by a small speech community, and ultimately a certain expression could be used by the entire speech community. That is, we have a collective process of meaning adoption and diffusion. And bringing together this idea from language evolution and the synchronic data, this could possibly account for the underlying processing patterns. In such a way that the ad hoc use or the use in a particular context requires inferential work, requires reconceptualization and a referential shift, which is reflected in processing costs. While on the other hand, the large-scale dispersion leads to conventionalization and the application of cognitive routines. And so we shouldn't observe a cost in that anymore if this has entered the lexical representation, basically. How can we test this? Yeah, usually language change happens across a long time, and we're looking at language processing, which happens right now. I think a promising testing ground for the evolution of new meanings might be looking at these place for event metonymies, because they evolve rapidly as an event happens. So in 2, we have a very recent example, as one has known not only since Ischgl, herds of infection in connection with travel activities have devastating effects, said the doctor, right? So here we refer to Ischgl as a hotspot for COVID-19, at least for everybody living in the south of Germany where I live. And so for a while, Ischgl was used as the event and not the place. Hopefully, in 3 to 4 years, we will no longer remember that Ischgl was a hotspot for COVID-19. So what we can see here is that this type of metonymy evolves quickly. It might stay in our mental repertoire as the Woodstock case, or become even more important than the place, but it could also decay after a while again. So we wanted to look at these place for event metonymies. And so what we first did is we selected a number of places that we associated with historic events or some other event. And we told participants that we wanted to create new cards for the game Taboo. So Taboo is a game where you have to describe a concept and avoid using the labels on the card. Right, so we were hoping that people would put very salient, strongly associated labels onto these taboo cards. And then we looked at whether these associations were related to the place or to the event. So here in this case, Woodstock, Joe Cocker, Jimi Hendrix, 1969 New York concert mainly refers to the event. We then grouped our metonymies into a group of those that mostly had event associations and others that had mostly place associations. And we then recorded event-related brain potentials. And what we found is for those that had a dominant event association, which probably is also always available with the place representation, they didn't show any processing costs in the ERP. And those metonymies where the place association was strongly available to the participants showed a late positivity for the cases where the event was used in blue relative to the place in red. So this seems to suggest that it's actually possible to kind of create an in vitro metonymy situation where we can look at conventionalized meanings and ad hoc meanings by looking at these place for event metonymies. So to wrap up, so I have tried to argue that we need to distinguish between different types of meaning adjustment. The distinction engenders discrete processing profiles and may be grounded in stages of language evolution. And so on the one hand, we have conventionalized uses that relate to a large-scale dispersion and should be reflected in easy sense selection in language processing. On the other hand, we have these ad hoc uses which emerge in specific situations and require additional processing costs because we need to reconceptualize and update our mental representations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Petra.
Thank you for the inspiring talk. So we have about 25 minutes for questions now. Okay, I think Larry was the quickest.
Yeah, unless there's someone more junior. Almost everyone here is more junior than me.
I see Camillo has a question.
Yeah.
Camillo, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, my connection is really bad. I was wondering, so first of all, thank you, Petra, for the talk. That was really, really lovely. So I was wondering about what your thoughts are on the relationship between aptness and familiarity of metonymy. Because it seemed like in your last slide, you might be hinting at the fact that it's a metonymic expression's conventionality that drives kind of the processing costs. The more conventional the metonymy, the lesser the processing costs. But do you think this is driven purely by these factors that you were talking about, like a group that starts using it and then it spreads? Or do you think that there are intrinsic properties that make a metonymic expression particularly good, and that this is because, and this might drive the lower processing costs, such as it's been shown for metaphors, for example?
So I mean, so in a number of these studies, we actually controlled very strongly for familiarity. So I think that's probably not the the only driving force. But I think it's, I mean, especially with these ad hoc type of metonymies, when you use a particular property to refer to a person, it also depends on the speaker and whether they feel comfortable using this type of metonymy, right? So we would have to create certain contexts or certain situations where it's really essential to use this as a way of referring. So I'm actually thinking of, there's a study by, or a paper by Markus Egg, where he used this Baukastenkorpus, so what's the English word for it? So basically people got blocks and had to construct certain objects. And if you knew that you had to construct a plane, then you would start referring to certain blocks by the function of the plane. And so this was a kind of nice setup where you have instruct the speakers to use a particular type of metonymy as a way to accomplish their communicative goal. And so I think this is the type of context that we would need to look at these individual aspects of the speaker.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Because I'm specifically thinking about how the classic examples are always these kind of like the waiter refers to the customer as the ham sandwich. And this is a case where the waiter, this is the only thing that the waiter knows about the customer, that he ordered a ham sandwich. So it's an extremely salient property. Right. It would be almost the only way to refer to cases, I guess. But yes, thank you.
I mean, quite often they use the ham sandwich at table 10. So they have two salient properties to refer to the person, right? In the classic examples.
True, yeah.
As far as junior people go, I think Josh, if I'm not mistaken, is probably more junior than the other hands up. So why don't you go ahead?
Sure, thank you. Thanks so much for the talk. I have a question actually about relating this to a bit of earlier work that you've done on the processing of real and fake compounds. So from that work, if I'm remembering correctly, we saw the similar kind of contradiction-induced positivity when you have the fake type adjective composition. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on to what extent that's the same kind of reconceptualization as is involved in metonymy. It doesn't seem like it requires any of the kind of sort of salient Woodstock type background world knowledge understanding of knowing how to interpret that. Things like fake are very productive. So I was wondering what your thoughts on whether these are the same thing, how you might tell them apart, what the semantic or pragmatic distinction therein is.
That's a great question, yeah. So I actually, so I believe that the late positivity that we observe for these metonymies and that we observe for the composition of something like a fake gun is the same kind of mechanism, because my understanding or my interpretation of the late positivity is that it reflects mental model updating processes. So in the case of the fake gun, we also need to update our representation because we start out with a gun, but then we combine it with fake gun, and a fake gun doesn't have all the properties that a proper gun has. In particular, it can't kill anyone and so on. So you need to modify your representation accordingly. And so in this sense, I would say that it's a way of reconceptualization. It's a way of inferring the intended meaning, and therefore represents the same mechanism. The interesting part was that in the fake gun example, the positivity showed up a lot earlier. And so this might indicate that when you have fake, you already know that whatever noun you get afterwards or whatever concept has to be modified, right? So you can already anticipate this kind of updating mechanism, and so it can occur earlier. Yeah, but it's a great question. But I actually, the way I look at it is that we have a mental representation, and we have to repair it or reanalyze it because in the compositional process, things don't things require us to modify our representation.
The prediction from that would then be that for something like Stone Lion, the positivity would be later because Stone doesn't cue you to, oh, I know that I'm going to have to reconceptualize something here. I don't remember the data on that point.
Yeah. Yeah, so Stone Lion shows the late positivity around 600 milliseconds, similar to the Cabernet Sauvignon.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Well, the order for the next three questions would be Larry, Maria, and Uli.
Okay.
Larry, why don't we go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Ira. Well, I'm non-junior enough to remember that Woodstock didn't actually take place in Woodstock. It took place in Bethel, New York. And so there is this conventional association of Woodstock with the event, even though it doesn't actually pick out the place, literally. My question has to do with whether we can kind of mediate between the conventionalized and ad hoc situations. You kind of did that in some of your remarks where you're contextualizing the ad hoc association strongly enough that it might indeed arguably reduce response time. So the kinds of examples I was thinking of is if you set up the context as one in which, for instance, the doctors on a given wing of the hospital make a practice of referring to patients by the disease or injury that they're afflicted with. And so you have instances of the appendicitis in 215 needs to have his bedpan changed, or the collapsed lung in 372 needs to have her breakfast, and so on. Whether then you would have, an instance of the prostate biopsy in room 67 needs blah, 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 have much reduced latency time in response because you have kind of set up this association. You can do the same thing with, of course, with waiters in the restaurant. So the idea is that once you set up the practice, it becomes a kind of ad hoc or local convention. And so even though it won't last beyond that particular experimental study, for the purpose of the study, someone is kind of willing to have these synapses act as though they're there. So I don't know if there's work along these lines that's been done.
No, I think it would be a great testing ground to either create this special use of metonymy within an experimental setting. So I don't know if anyone from the experimental semiotics groups is here, but this is what they are trying to do when they look at the creation of meaning and constructing nice experimental designs where people start to develop their own kind of lingo or language. And the other approach would be to look at experts, like to run a study with medical people or with waiters in a restaurant
staff.
and see whether they actually use that kind of language. But I would like to do in one of my new projects is really to also look at communication. And in that case, there would be like one participant who really uses a particular kind of ad hoc metonymy quite frequently, and then we could see whether in the course of like a 1 or 2 hour conversation, interlocutors would get so used to this particular type of meaning extensions that it becomes conventionalized for the moment of the for the testing. Yeah. And since you made a comment on Woodstock, a comment I didn't make because I was felt rushed, is the interesting finding was that when I asked German students what they associate with Vietnam, they only get the place. They say things about, you know, beach and vacation and so on. So for them, there's no historic event at all.
Well, it might have to do with the age also.
Right.
If they were around like when I was, they might, maybe not as strongly as American respondents, but still. You know.
I mean, I associate the historic event with it, so, but they didn't. Yeah.
I always like the anti-Vietnam demonstrators, as if the demonstrators were against Vietnam when it was kind of elliptical for anti-Vietnam War demonstrators.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Maria next now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Very nice work, Petra. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, I don't, maybe it's my perception, but that you are dealing with both a kind of categoricality from the perspective of the ERP signal on the one hand, but a kind of continuity with respect to the, you know, the ties that you want to make to the evolution, right? So you're, in terms of the categoricality, actually, what we found when we looked at both the, what Larry was calling ad hoc, but which we call circumstantial metonymy versus the systematic metonymy, place for event, that sort of thing, was that both for, you know, you have overlapping, when you look at neuroimaging, for example, you have overlapping activations for both, so suggesting that the same kind of, the same recruitment, brain recruitment seems to happen, or very similar. And then when we looked at children, and this is work that we've done with Andy Jung, is that children are faster at picking up the developmental trajectory for children for systematic metonymy, place for event, producer for product it gets set earlier than the one for you know, the ham sandwich kind of thing, the circumstantial metonymy. So so those two things kind of unite them, even though we also found the late category, the late activation for the circumstantial metonymy, which we did not find for the systematic. So so that was the you know, the dilemma was, where do you place the problem? Are we dealing with two different kinds of processes, or are we dealing with very much the same process and then maybe some gradient differences? And we felt for the latter. We said it's the same process, two different, it's just more context. But then now that you bring in this issue of the evolutionary force, then how would we have gone from you know, say an issue of circumstantial metonymy, right, where everything is local, to the systematic, you know, to a situation where you have just set kinds of metonymic processes that you can rely on. So you know, evolutionarily, how do you expect that to have happened? I don't expect you to have a set answer. I just wanted to see what your thoughts were.
Mm-hmm. Well, so in the ad hoc stage, I need to, you know, establish some kind of connections, draw some inferences about the speaker's intentions. So this is going to be a complex kind of process. But then once this linguistic expression is used by more and more people, then the new meaning enters the lexical representation. And then we somehow have to, so then somehow we don't have to use inferential work anymore to arrive at the intended meaning, because in our lexical representation, we have an underspecified representation, or a rich representation that specifies, well, this is an author, but it also can also refer to his work. So I think when you see these common brain signatures, then this probably reflects the semantic work that we have to do to establish a link between, you know, a property and a person, or also the semantic, between a property and a person. And this can either then also require inferential work and what I have called reconceptualization, but it also needs access to some kind of lexical representation or encyclopedic knowledge or something like that. So then the evolutionary process would go from inferencing to more lexical encoding and lexical access.
Okay.
Okay, so Uli next.
Okay, my question is about the relation between metonymy and deixis. So in many cases, you can also sort of deictically pick out a referent by referring, like pointing at a something related to that referent. Like say I go out with friends for wine, and then they all leave me alone at the table, and I can point at the glass of one of them and say, she talks a lot. And to what extent is that the same process? And could your research sort of elucidate that kind of parallel?
Yeah. Well, I think I would want to say that it's the same process, because you're referring to the wine glass, but you mean the person that's associated with it. So now the work that I have to do is a little more complex, because I have a pronoun. So I need to first realize that the pronoun, well, but we also have a pointing gesture. So I think it's probably the same process. I don't even know if it's more complicated, because we have something associated with that person. And so then, and you say she, and you point to a glass.
Nunberg had similar examples where you hold up the New York Times and you say that just went down 3 points, meaning the stock of the newspaper that this is a token of.
All right. So I think I would want to say that it's the same process, but it's an interesting question that, yeah.
Okay, so there's one more question in the chat by Carita Paradis.
Okay, I also think this is an interesting question, because I suppose what a Gestalt psychologist would say is that it's a salience process in the same way, metonymy and index in this sense. But this was not my question. I was thinking, if you sort of try to prime, because these examples that you gave were sort of out of context in the experiment. If you ran the same experiment but tried to prime the same trials with a context, would then the differences disappear between these? Because that would be a way to mirror the process of change, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I mean?
I'm not so quite sure what you mean by priming with the context.
But if you have one of these where you read Brecht and you pick out Brecht, or where you have a difference between these two, if you prime these sentences with, like, you are in the library, or
okay.
yeah, before, and another context for the other reading, because then maybe these things about what is more conventionalized will disappear, sort of thing.
Yeah, so I actually went, so I didn't really discuss the examples in great detail, but what we had, at least for the ERP studies and also the eye tracking study that I presented, is that we always had a context sentence that said something like, the barkeeper asked the waitress who was talking a lot. The waitress answered that the Cabernet talked a lot. Versus the barkeeper asked the waitress what was out of stock. The waitress said that the Cabernet Sauvignon was out of stock. So we had at least this minimal context with this question answer sequence that made it clear that we're after either a person in the answer or some kind of object denoting entity. And so when you deprive these contexts of the specific situation that you actually need for the metonymy, and you just say, Paul asked Peter, who was talking a lot tonight. Peter said that the Cabernet was talking a lot. What we observe there is that there's an early effect of context reflected in an N400 in the ERP, or in first pass, longer first pass times in the eye tracking, because there's no contextual support. But you still find the later effect, that is the late positivity or longer total times or more regressions back. So what this indicates is that independent of the contextual manipulation, we can actually observe this process of updating the mental representation. So even if
which makes sense.
Yeah, so even if
Yeah.
you don't get the information that this is uttered in a restaurant context, you probably still want to make sense of it. And the only way to make sense of it is that the Cabernet must be referring to a person associated with the Cabernet.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question by Vinicius.
Hi, hello. I'm really sorry I won't be able to turn my camera on tonight, but so apologies for that. But yeah, thank you very much. This is very, very interesting work. I was wondering, so what your predictions would be if you were to look at, for example, in the case of ERPs, what would happen if you basically have someone who is basically in the middle of the conventionalization process, right? So we are assuming that we have the ad hoc inferences on the one end, and then basically we have the sort of a lexicalized ones on the other, right? But what do we find in between? Is it a categorical difference such that it's basically flat, right? Or is it a difference basically in amplitude, right? Where it's like, okay, there's something here that is probabilistic as opposed to just nothing at all, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know.
Next experiment.
Yeah, it's a difficult experiment to run. I don't know, I kind of feel, even though in many other ways I never, think in terms of categorical differences, but here I have the feeling that it might be a categorical difference, that, when you first encounter something and you have to infer a particular meaning, then this is costly. But once you've done this, then you should be able to access that particular reading again. So I would want to say, it's either ad hoc and inferencing, or you can use your lexical network to retrieve the intended meaning. But it's an open question, so I don't know, and I would have to think about how this can be tested. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have time for just one more quick question, Louisa.
Yeah, hi. This is kind of an information question. So I'm curious about whether certain kinds of polysemy, that if there is literature that looks at certain kinds of polysemy that I think people don't usually talk about in the metonymy literature as metonymy, if I ask that question correctly. So I'm thinking about things like with nominalizations, event and result, or event and artifact, things like translation. people don't tend to think of those things as metonymically produced, but it doesn't seem like a crazy hypothesis to me. And so I was just curious whether, thinking in terms of diachrony and so forth, whether there's any literature on that.
I have no idea. That's a quick answer, but it's an interesting question. I can look into that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There is some literature on metonymy and change, of course, but there is not this type of categorical standard textbook examples of metonymy, because there is also this continuum of metonymization in different meanings, of course. But metonymization in change has been discussed in the more recent literature on metonymy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But it's a different kind of literature, I think, and the two sort of never meet.
Okay, we have time for
Sorry
one
for
more.
jumping in here, but
Time for one more last question from Asya. Then we'll wrap it up.
Yes, just a follow up with the categorical distinction. So would you think that the computing of the metonymy, ad hoc metonymies, goes into a completely separate route as computing conventionalized metonymies, the meaning, when you derive the meaning? Is it the case that for conventionalized metonymy, you basically have a polysemous word that you directly access the meaning of Dickens as the book because it's already in the lexicon? So you kind of take a shortcut, you don't go through the route of computation. Or is your argument is that you do go through the computation, you just do it much faster?
I think what the SAT data suggest is that we do go through some kind of, selection process. So it's not that it's, it's equally accessible.
Okay.
I think this is what we are taking from the SAT data, that there's a difference in the asymptote, but not in the speed parameter.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that I think wraps it up. Thank you so much, Petra. Thank you all for coming. Keep your eyes peeled for the next meeting, which is typically the second Thursday of the month. Nicole, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the next speaker is Heather Burnett, who's speaking together with Celine Posniak. So we're looking forward to that, and we're looking forward to seeing you again also. So thanks a lot for coming, and see you soon.
Thanks. Mm-hmm.